Well, political parties say they are awaiting Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's ideas on tackling the financial crisis issues within state-owned enterprises.
Some suggestions include freezing salary increases in all government departments and SOE's middle and top managers.
The biggest demand, obviously, is going to be for a bailout for Eskom. Eskom has already asked for 100 billion rand. So we anticipate that there's going to be some way that Eskom are going to be bailed out, which is not all going to happen now, and some of it may be kicked down the road until the medium-term budget policy statement.
The SOEs remain a bane of South Africa, and the injections which are expected into Eskom, SA and so on are really not justified in the absence of a turnaround strategy for governance and for ensuring that there's consequence management for those who actually collapse these SOEs.
Well, from where we're sitting, at some point it will have to be bailed out, like we bailed out recently SAA, which is a vanity project. But I think more in particular, what would require from government, and the Minister of Finance in particular, is for him to outline this unbundling plan and how it's going to be funded, how it's going to be structured.
Debt service costs are essentially have the potential to squeeze out spending on other areas and other programs. Government has taken steps to mitigate risks associated with increasing borrowing costs through issuing debt over a longer maturity period. Although, as we know, net loan debt, as my colleague has stated already, is still expected to increase over the next 3 years.
Let's bring in SABC Anchor Nompu Siziba, who's live for us in Cape Town for the all-important budget space. Nompu, very good morning to you. What can we expect today?
Hi, thanks very much, Blaine. Well, it's a very big day today. There are lots of things that Finance Minister Tito Mboweni needs to juggle. And of course, the big issue is Eskom. It's gone to the government and said it needs at least 100 billion rand assistance. It wants the government to take about 100 billion rand onto its balance sheet so that they're free to go into the market and borrow more money, which sounds very interesting indeed. It just means that they just go into a deeper downward spiral of debt. But to unpack what we can expect from the budget today, I'm joined by Tabi Lioka. She's an independent economist. Thanks very much for joining us, as always, Tabi. So how can government possibly assist Eskom and still create a budget that's budget neutral, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that it's going to be very difficult because already we're seeing that we have a deficit in revenue. So we've collected far less than we had expected. I predict about 10 billion less on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, he'd have to cut very aggressively. And I was looking at the budget, the MTBPS, and trying to make my own estimations as to where he would cut. And, you know, you can't really cut in education. You can't really cut in health. You can't really cut in social development because that's where the social grants are. I looked at the military and I thought maybe we could take something from defense. And then yesterday I listened to military trading and I thought, you know, already the military budget is not that large. It's going to be very, very tough financial engineering. The other thing so he has to trim expenditure. We hope that, which is not a good thing to hope for, but we hope what usually happens is that there's a lot of underspending by government departments. And I say it's not a good thing because if there's underspending in housing, that means that what you planned for as a minister before the budget was allocated, you haven't really fulfilled those plans. There's excess funds which are now going to be allocated towards helping some of our state-owned entities, and namely Eskom being such an important one to the economy. So I think that could be our saving grace, but it's also not a long-term solution. It's a very short-term solution. Eskom is hemorrhaging about 10 billion or more a month, I'm told. So even if we had to allocate 20 billion, it doesn't last very long.
And what I was hearing about Eskom in terms of the load shedding we experienced last week was that they were spending up to 100 million rand per day just on diesel to keep the lights on.
Absolutely. You know what was shocking about the load shedding is that we went straight into the highest level in terms of load shedding, 7 units down. So imagine if you are the Minister of Finance, and remember the budget is looked at and planned and assessed and reassessed after the last year's budget, medium-term budget. So it's a work in progress. And then, so as you're allocating and as you're discussing your allocations in the National Treasury, then this happens, Eskom happens. So it's unexpected, and suddenly you have to now reorganize your own budgets and shift money elsewhere to saving Eskom and some of our state-owned entities that are critical. So it is a very, very tough position that Minister Tito Mboweni is faced with, and this is his first budget as the Minister of Finance, because last year he did the MTBPS, and we don't know whether it's his last one, but this will be quite a cracker of a budget.
It's going to be quite a test for him indeed, and of course it's not just Eskom, although Eskom is the biggie, but there are other SOEs that are going to need assistance. South African Airways, we've already heard that they're getting 3.5 billion, and I suppose that came out before the budget because they probably needed that lifeline immediately just to remain sustainable. But how sustainable is South African Airways? We understand the importance of Eskom because without it, it's going to impact the economy. But why is it so important for us to keep on funding SAA when it clearly isn't performing and it's not a core asset?
Yeah. So I did have this discussion with some economists and treasury officials about what is core and what is non-core. And apparently what is core is something that it's within the constitution. So something like transport that links to housing, and so transporting South Africans is quite core. That's strategic in nature, and that's why the government sees it as an important entity to save. Something like Eskom is core because it provides electricity for households and also for businesses. And I think that in the absence of having railway in the country that would link cities and towns, we're left with aviation. And the other thing that when I look at state-owned entities, I think that we need to consider the past 9-10 years and how badly they were managed. So much corruption, so much malfeasance, that we shouldn't be surprised that they are at this current state. Literally, SAA, and SA Express was on its belly, and now we've got people who are trying to sort it out. In the same way as Eskom is currently in a fix. Same way with Denel, same way with Transnet. All our SOEs, state capture, the core of state capture happened in our SOEs. So I think that we need to exercise patience as well, because it will take almost as long to sort it out as it did to actually lead it to where these entities are currently. So I think that talking about SAA, I think that the minister will announce measures in which how to rejig, restructure SAA. We could see a merger, which was mentioned actually about a year ago between SAA and SA Express and Mango. But I think that it's something that the minister and the president mentioned in the state-owned entities. At the SONA, that these state-owned entities are very important and they should be saved. The other thing I want to add too, I know that there's been a lot of discussion about privatizing and nationalizing. I think that debate is neither here nor there. What is important is the right people to run these organizations and also the right board. And if you don't have the right governance structure, the right people, whether it's private or government entity, it will falter. So I think that we need to ensure that even if we sell some of these entities, we don't sell them for a song just because they're not performing currently. We make sure that they're stabilized and then make the decision on whether to sell it or not.
You say these things, Tabi, but do we have the capacity for all of these boards? Do we have the necessary capacity? I mean, for example, all the respect to him, Mr. Pagamani Khadebe, for example, we know that he's got a lot of experience in banking, but my understanding is that he has no experience in the energy sector. And when you look at other leaders across the world who head massive organizations in the energy sector, they have a lot. You can see they've got a long list. So to what extent is it important that people actually have a lot of experience in the fields that they're actually leading?
Yeah, that's a good question. But the last CEO, who was CEO, I think it was acting CEO for a very short time, Machele Koko, he's an engineer and has a long history of working in the energy sector. And look what he did to Eskom. So I think that whether Pagamani is an engineer or not is not important right now, only because we've had engineers with a long history, with long experience that actually led to Eskom's demise or contributed to Eskom's demise. So I think, Pagamani Khatebe has a big role to play. I think that he will try as best he has been trying as best he can, trying to get the best engineers possible to also recover. I know that they've talked about unbundling, which I'm also uncertain as to how it will be unbundled, but that would also help in terms of stabilizing the entity. We talk about privatization of generation. It's already partly privatized because there's already PPPs, public-private partnerships happening there, with the IPPs coming in play. So I think that you should give some of these entities time. I also believe that it's not really time for people who are expertise necessarily in that field, but people who understand how to run a business and how to stabilize a business, and that's important. Once it's stabilized, then we can get the best engineer to run it. But a best engineer may not be able to run a business. Yeah. So we need to get the right people and the right balance in place. But governance is absolutely crucial. Without governance, you can put the best people as a CEO, but if they don't follow, they don't understand governance, these companies, these entities will collapse.
Absolutely, as we've seen already. Last question, Tabi. The Finance Minister has to tread a very tight rope. And we've talked about the support that Eskom and other SOEs need. How is he going to be able to do that without the ratings agencies coming down our necks, because that will have massive financial market impacts? It may see the rand depreciate, etc., which will be negative for our economy, which is struggling already.
Yeah, I think any reform will be very difficult, and unfortunately for us, it's happening at a time where we have the Eskom problem. We have Moody's, which we are just one notch above junk status, and we have to make tough decisions. If we are to bring Eskom's balance sheet onto the national balance sheet, it then also has implications on our debt profile. So our debt to GDP will worsen, and we may require borrowing borrowing more, which also will increase our debt servicing costs, which are currently 10% of our total budget. So there's very tough decisions, and unfortunately, I'm hoping that Moody's is more understanding. I think they have been very understanding in the past couple of years. I hope that they just give us a little bit of room, because I think that we just need a year or so just to normalize and stabilize our state-owned entities. So I hope that after the budget, the National Treasury usually speaks to rating agencies, and I hope that they can convince them that we are actually working on turning the economy around, and it's not going to be a straight line and it's not going to be a smooth road, but we're doing the right things.
Okay, Tabi, thank you very much for your time. That was independent economist Tabi Leoka just giving us her thoughts on what we can expect from the budget today. Like she says, the government currently spends about 10% of its total revenue on paying debt, that is paying interest on the debt that we currently have, which is around 3 trillion rand. It's likely that between government and Eskom, that number is going to tick up quite quickly as they go back to the markets to borrow more money to try and deal with the various priorities that we have. In the midterm budget policy statement in October, the government did indicate that the debt servicing costs would rise to 15% by the 2021-2022 year, and that was not bearing in mind that Eskom was going to have the kind of crisis that it's having right now. So that number could also rise. Another concern is our budget deficit. That is the difference between what government spends and the revenue that it receives. And to plug that gap, it normally has to go to the markets to get debt. There is an expectation that that figure is going to widen, which tends to be very negative. When markets look at that number as it widens, they usually sell off on the rand. But anyway, we're going to see what happens, and we're going to continue speaking to more guests as the day progresses. Back to you, Blaine.
Yeah, Nompu, it's going to be interesting to see the SOE allocations. And, you spoke about SAA, and they were recently talking about this internal reconfiguration of their resources and basically focusing on introducing these 3 business units within their current group of network. But they also